It strikes me that if you look at the late years of the 20th century, there were a lot of reasons to feel better about markets. You had obviously the collapse of the Soviet Empire. You had a series of decisions by the Clinton administration, many of which you were part of, that seemed to work out quite well, that I think people would have described as sort of, in some ways, neoliberal, maybe more center-left than left-center. And in the last 15 years, it seems that things have changed a little bit, that the evidence of the last 15 years suggests that we should have less confidence in the kind of outcomes that the market produces. That even though the economy has been growing for much of that time, we've had extremely weak income growth. We've also had 2 bursting bubbles, one of them terribly. Is that a fair frame to describe why we often hear you today talking about steps that government needs to take as opposed to concerns about government going too far?
Yeah, I think that's probably roughly fair, David. People often say to me, how can you must have changed your mind hugely because you were an advocate for the Clinton administration's policies in the 1990s, and you are an advocate for the things you're an advocate for today, so you must have changed your mind or changed your values. I wouldn't want to claim that 20 years of experience hasn't changed my perspective on some things, but I think it's much more that my values have been constant and the world has changed, and therefore the application of my values to the world calls for different approaches. In 1993, when Bill Clinton came into office, it was reasonable to think that the principal reason why middle-class wages were stagnant was that productivity growth was low. It was reasonable to think that an important part of the reason why productivity growth was low was that there was too little capital investment, and that an important part of the reason why there was too little capital investment was that the cost of capital, as measured by real interest rates or as measured by the level of equity markets, was too high. And so an economic strategy that was centered on raising the rate of growth by bringing down costs of capital, and spurring private investment to raise productivity growth would be a broadly availing economic strategy. And that was Bill Clinton's economic strategy. That was what was called Clintonomics. Sometimes it was called Rubinomics. It had reduction in budget deficits at the very center of it. It had the idea that there were these huge markets abroad that, if they opened up and they prospered, would create huge markets for American products as an additional crucial element. It had the idea that moving to a presumption of permission with respect to information technology would allow the internet to grow fastest in the United States and would be a major source of competitive advantage for the United States. And I think all 3 of those ideas, if one looks back at that time and that place, deficit reduction to reduce costs of capital, trade agreements to spur growth and create markets for American products, reduced regulation to assure that a profound new technology would be applied as rapidly as possible. I think those were all the correct judgments, and I think the economic results during the 1990s bear out the wisdom of those policies. If you look at economic policy 20 years later, in the middle of the decade, the second decade of the 21st century, you see a very different picture. You see that inequality has increased massively. You see that the incomes of the top 1% have grown more rapidly than the Chinese economy as one example, and the top 100% has far outstripped the top 1%, you see and can calculate that if the income distribution had remained constant and income was the same, the bottom 80% would have $1 trillion more, or about $8,000 per family. The top 1% would have $1 trillion less, or about $700,000 less per family. And the middle 19%, between the 80th percentile and the 99th percentile, would be about the same. So you see that what's happening to distribution is central to the well-being of middle-class families. You see that insufficiently regulated financial markets had done enormous damage in causing the great financial crisis, not to mention the recession of 2001, which affects any sensible person's view about regulation. And you see that the interest rate is zero, and corporations have trillions of dollars of cash on their balance sheet, and they're not investing. And so whatever's holding business back, it's not costs of capital associated with budget deficits. It's lack of demand for their products. And so the broad parameters of an approach to the same objective of raising middle-class standards of living are very different than they were 20 years ago. They go to issues like spurring demand. They go to pointing up the folly of the fact that the United States is investing less in infrastructure relative to the economy than at any point since the Second World War, at a moment when capital costs are lower than at any point since the Second World War. They go to asking how a great nation can really comfortably tolerate year after year, decade after decade, Kennedy Airport. Not to mention LaGuardia. So they go to questions of demand that put people back to work. They go to questions of adequate regulation. They go to questions of inequality as crucial for middle-class standards of living. And so it seems to me that, yes, that there's a very important difference between the kinds of theories economists need to come up with and the kinds of theories that physicists need to come up with. Physicists are chasing a constant reality. The physical laws are what they were 100 years ago. They are what they were a millennium ago. They are what they are a billion years ago. It may be that there are different spaces we want to understand, the cosmological dimension, the subatomic dimension, but there is a constant physical reality. On the other hand, while human nature is perhaps a constant, the nature of economic systems changes profoundly. And so the kinds of economic thinking that were appropriate to the Depression or were appropriate to the United States in the first couple of years of President Obama's term are very different in a deflationary demand-short economy than they are in an inflationary supply-short economy like the one we did in the 1970s. And so it's the nature of economic theory that because it is chasing a moving target, that it is itself an evolving and changing doctrine. And that's especially true with respect to economic policy thinking, I would argue, David.
Let me ask you an existential question. How worried about all of this are you? And by that I mean, when you take a couple of the different ideas that you've talked a lot about, stagnation of middle-class living standards, which is to say material living standards are not improving for most Americans, and secular stagnation, which we may talk more about later, basically it presents a very worrisome picture. And then you add in the dysfunction of our government. They're not doing many of the things you talk about. When I hear your Kennedy Airport example, when I think about my own ride to work in the Washington metro system, I think about the idea that if there is a latter-day Gibbon who writes The Decline and Fall of the United States, these will be the examples that that Gibbon would use, which I hope never happens. But do you feel as if the United States is flirting with really serious diminution in its standing in the world and its economic might? Or are these medium-scale problems and the overwhelming likelihood is 50, 100 years from now, the United States' global position will still look roughly like what it looks like today?
Somewhere in between, which makes it hard for me to be as vivid as I might like to be, but I think that's the price of being reasonable. When I hear people banging on about us as ancient Rome and us as the British Empire collapsing and all of that, I think to myself, in my lifetime, there was really no question as during the end of the Cold War, that as the joke that appeared in every issue of the Harvard Business Review had it, the Cold War was over and Germany and Japan had won. That 20 years before that, actually less, 15 years before that, the President of the United States had gone on national television to declare a crisis of the national spirit. That a decade before that, Henry Kissinger had felt a need to rearrange the parameters of American foreign policy because the basic constellation of forces was moving against us. That 15 years before that, John Kennedy had believed throughout his presidency that the likelihood was that the Soviet Union would surpass us by 1980 in an economic sense. And that indeed Patrick Henry declared in 1792 that the spirit of the revolution had been lost. So I have a very strong faith that it is precisely this capacity for the Jeremiad, precisely this capacity to generate self-denying prophecies of doom that has made America an enormously resilient society, and that it is precisely the fact that people like all of you come and participate in forums like this in so many places in so many different ways that gives America a capacity for regeneration and renewal. So I think ultimately that problems have a way of getting solved. Now, is the United States going to be in precisely the position it's occupied in the last 50 years? It's going to be in that position for the next century? I wouldn't want to confidently say yes. Is there enormous amounts of what goes on in our country that frustrates me? Yes. But in the 5 years since I left government, I have spent a lot of time traveling to almost every part of the world and spent time talking with public policy makers, private sector business leaders. And for all our problems, I would rather have the hand that the United States has than the hand that any other country has. And I think if you step back, look, there's an enormous amount to be frustrated about. These questions of growth and equality, they are huge issues. But I went back and I read, and what I was saying was not unbelievably original. Others were saying it, about the critical problems the country faced that seemed insoluble in 2007. would we be able to have universal health care? And if we did have universal health care, wouldn't it blow the back off health care inflation? We have universal health care, and health care inflation has been slower relative to the economy for the last 5 years now than any 5 years since the Second World War. American presidents have been talking about energy independence since the early 1970s. And serious scholars have been writing about how presidents can talk, but it's not a realistic vision. North American energy independence will be achieved within a small number of years, and my bet would be that within a decade, the United States will be a net exporter of oil, as we are already a net exporter of natural gas. Healthcare, education. There's plenty to argue about and plenty to challenge and more work to be done, but we have had the most comprehensive reform of financial regulation in 60 years that has passed. The country has assimilated the idea of gay rights more rapidly than anyone would have imagined. No presidential candidate in 2008 would have found it plausible that within an 8-year presidency, gay marriage would be the law of the land in all 50 in all 50 states. So I don't think there's plenty to be worried about, but I think existential despair is hardly warranted. You can look at it in other ways. When I went to school, we did like nuclear weapons drills, getting under desks. And that was serious stuff. Yes, we can debate what the right amount for the United States to spend on national defense is, but we are spending half as a share of GDP what we spent through the so-called golden years from 1945 to 1973. There's plenty we need to do to raise middle-class standards of living, but I would invite anybody to thumb through a Sears catalog in 1973 and say that the basic standard of living of middle-class families is today what it was in 1973. So yes, I am terribly worried about inequality. Yes, I am terribly worried about macroeconomic stability and secular stagnation. Yes, I am worried about a rising China, but I do not think existential dread is warranted by the facts, and I think it's a singularly unconstructive posture as well.
A footnote, particularly given where we are, the best thing I've ever read on how prophecies of doom have helped the United States avoid outcomes of doom is written by James Fallows, the Atlantic writer, and I'm sure it's 2 Google clicks away. I would encourage all you to look it up because it's the long version of the case that you just made. So you mentioned Dodd-Frank. I have no doubt of the importance of the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. It has made coverage close to universal. Although it doesn't appear to have caused the slowdown in health costs, it seems to have meaningfully contributed to it, and there's no denying the slowdown in health costs. I don't feel the same way about Dodd-Frank, the financial reform bill. Now, maybe some of that is my fact that I know more about healthcare than I do about finance, but I'm guessing that most people would feel somewhat similarly, that whether they're in favor of Dodd-Frank or against it, it's not completely clear to me that Dodd-Frank is so important. It hasn't caused Wall Street to come back to the rest of the economy. Wall Street's continued to do much better than the rest of the economy. We've heard a lot of complaints from Wall Street, but Wall Street seems to be doing okay. How would you explain to people who are not experts why you think Dodd-Frank is A, meaningful, and B, good?
purpose of Dodd-Frank was not to punish the financial sector. You can debate whether the financial sector should have been more punished than the $100 billion in fines that it has paid, or it should have been less punished. You can debate whether compensation should be regulated to a greater extent than it has been regulated, and there certainly are strong arguments for that. That wasn't the purpose of Dodd-Frank either. The purpose of Dodd-Frank was to make future financial crisis less likely, or as close to not going to happen as possible. There hasn't been any financial crisis since Dodd-Frank, but it hasn't been very long, so we can't really judge its efficacy. So you have to look at what it did. Here are some things it did. I personally think they're pretty important. It used to be that there were all kinds of major financial institutions that were systemic, where it was no government regulator's job to make sure that they were safe. Parts of them, but the whole institution safe. That used to be the law of the land. That's now not the law of the land. You may say the law of the land before was terrible, but I think that's a pretty fundamental change. Institutions going broke and collapsing is about their not having cash on hand, and it's about their not having capital to pay off the competing claims. And capital requirements and liquidity requirements are vastly higher than they were before. That's a big thing too. It used to be, believe it or not, that there was no framework of any kind if a big complicated bank needed to fail. That there was sort of no procedure. There was a procedure for dealing with a little bank. That's what the FDIC knew how to do. But if a big institution got in trouble, there was no procedure. It was just kind of, we'll make it up as it goes, and there's no legal framework to do it. There are people still refining it, and there are all kinds of cross-border problems, but now there is a legal framework that does something about that. It used to be that the people who were in charge of protecting consumers were the same people who were in charge of making sure that banks were profitable so that they would never get in financial trouble. And so not very surprisingly, the consumer protection tended to get short shrift. Now there's an entirely independent and strong set of regulators around consumer financial protection. So I don't understand how you can look at those four things and say nothing important has happened unless you take a different kind of perspective. And the different kind of perspective is we just need to crush Wall Street, and we need to crush the people who are on it because that's just the right and just thing. That's just the right and just thing to do. And it wouldn't be my view, but I can see the arguments for it. But I think if you judge financial regulation by the objective of financial regulation, which is to prevent risks which will substantially disrupt the economy, you have to say that so far there haven't been risks, and you have to think that some pretty fundamental and important things have been done that make future crises less likely.
So I see a tension there that I'd love for you to work out. So you in your opening remarks, you talked about how much better the 1% have done than the bottom 80%, right? And this very stark transfer statistic. You also suggested that you're uncomfortable with the idea of, as your friend Tim Geithner would say, exacting some Old Testament punishment on Wall Street for the sake of doing it, right? So exacting punishment on Wall Street, it strikes me, for better or worse, maybe for worse, would move those numbers in your first answer meaningfully. So if going after Wall Street isn't the way to move those numbers because it would have other big damages, it would mess up our financial system, we'd lose our global role as a financial leader, what is the way to move those numbers that you cited at the beginning?
Well, I think the place to start is with seriously progressive taxation. The place to start is with the vast numbers of devices through which those who earn the most are able to pay the lowest share of their income in taxes. Some of it's got to do with, I mean, to take a couple of examples, carried interest. You work for a private equity firm, and you do a good job, and your company makes money, and somehow you pay taxes at capital gains rates. You work for a regular company, you pay taxes at twice capital gains rates at the tax rate on labor income. You make a successful investment. Good for you, you made a successful investment. You hold on, you buy the stock at 10, you're clever enough that the stock's really tremendous, the stock goes to 100, you leave the 100 to your children. Your children turn around and sell the stock for 110. What's the capital gain? Remember, capital gains are taxed at only half the rate that other income is taxed at. What's the rate your children pay the tax at? They pay taxes at half the rate on a gain of 10, and the entire movement from 10 to 100 entirely escapes taxation. Now, you might say that that would be okay, I don't think so, if you thought that the 100 in estate taxation was going to entirely was going to pay substantial estate taxation. But if you have consulted with even a moderately ingenious estate attorney, who, by the way, will find himself comfortably in the top 1% of the income distribution, you will be educated as to how the vast majority of that 100 can escape taxation through the establishment of a range of different kinds of trust arrangements. So the question is not whether it's okay that there's this high income. The question is, should we tax it in the same serious way that we tax the secretaries of the people who earn it? And I think the answer to that question is emphatically yes. And I think that is a much more direct way of going at the question of inequality than launching some kind of war on Wall Street. Look, these things are very complicated, and there may be better things to do. I'm sure there are a set of regulations we should implement. But let me take one example of the law of unintended consequences, the Volcker Rule. The Volcker Rule had a kind of idea behind it. The idea was that big banks are connected to the government because they might get bailed out, and therefore trading in financial assets should be taken out of those big banks and should be done separately. Well, that's happened. That has happened to a substantial extent. Those big banks never paid a trader $100 million. Never, ever. But there are several dozen people walking around New York every day who make more than $100 million a year, who never would have made more than $100 million a year, but for the Volcker Rule. Because they were salaried employees of big financial institutions. When the big financial institutions couldn't do it, they left and started their own hedge funds, which are not regulated in this way, and they're now making much more money. So the net effect of that, on its face, somewhat burdensome rule was actually to raise rather than reduce inequality. And I think one needs to think very carefully about the consequences of a range of the steps that one proposes. But certainly at a minimum, we ought to be able to agree as a country that there are two separate objectives. One is preventing future financial crises and causing capital to flow to its best use in the most efficient way. And the other is reducing inequality. And doing the first in the most burdensome way possible, whether it's effective or not in reducing crisis, seems an odd way, an oddly indirect and probably not very smart way of going about the second. Let me give you another example. People say that we should break up all the institutions, that really the institutions shouldn't be so big. Well, do you all remember the whale, the JP Morgan whale? You all remember it, and it was bad, and it was mad, you're mad, and JP Morgan should have done better, and JP Morgan paid a big fine. If JP Morgan had been broken up into 7 pieces, that would have been one of those pieces. That piece would have failed, and it would have been like the LTCM crisis, where there would have been a need for a government bailout and a big crisis. So in fact, the fact that we had a more diversified institution made the system safer, not more dangerous. So yes, maybe capital requirements should be higher than they are now, but I don't think we will get to a safe financial system if the criteria we use for judging regulation is how punitive it is.
How is it that we have, over the same 40 years, 35 years, had a huge increase in pre-tax inequality? How is it that we have also had an increase in the kind of inequality that happens through the tax system? Which is to say, more elegantly, how is it that at the same period we've had incomes at the top go up so much faster than incomes in the middle? We've had taxes at the top fall more than they have for any other group. They're still higher on average than they are for any other group, but they've fallen much more than for any other group. What's the political economy of that? And is it reasonable to think, however good the argument may be for higher taxation, that it's ever going to happen?
Look, I don't see how you can look at the gay rights thing. I don't see how you can look at energy independence. I don't see how you can look at the control of healthcare costs and say that things you believe should happen will never happen. I just think things happen. They happen they very often happen too slowly, but in the end, things tend to push towards the right place, and my guess is taxation will become more progressive. I don't know what the right political economy theory is, David. I kind of suspect that it may have to do with globalization in the following difficult sense. On the one hand, as the world has opened up and everything has become much more mobile, that does much more for Steve Schwartzman than it does for his secretary. That does much more for the people who attend the Aspen Ideas Festival than it does for the average American. And so there is a sense in which the extra opportunity created by globalization, while it's a positive, is not a particularly egalitarian positive, at least on the income earning side. But it also has a consequence, because it means that it's easier to escape. Not for my secretary to escape. She's not going to go to another country in order to have a lower tax rate. But it is easier for corporations to move income with accounting tricks, to move income with production. And so the pressure of international competition both creates more inequality and makes it more difficult to have progressive taxation to combat that inequality, because there's more elasticity at the high end than there is at the low end. And I think that may be the economic force that is driving some of this, along with a set of political problems having to do with money and politics and all of that. That's why I made a major priority during my time as Treasury Secretary of doing things about what I used to call the dark side of capital mobility. Yes, it's good for capital to flow across international borders to the best use. But when it's tax evasion and tax sheltering, when it's regulatory arbitrage, when it's money laundering, then it's not so good. And those aren't things that one country can combat alone. And I think some of the same political capital that we've seen devoted to trade agreements needs to be devoted to internationally economic cooperative arrangements that are more fully directed at standing up for worker interests rather than business interests, and greater cooperation with respect to the dark side of capital mobility is one such priority.
Okay. My guess is we're going to come back to inequality and taxes during questions. So let me hit you with a couple of quick questions about things in the news. Greece. You're on a panel tomorrow about Greece, so we can do the short version. I think a lot of Americans at this point basically feel like it's Greece, it's not all of Europe, it's not a huge economy, we've seen this before, they're going to muddle through, it's going to be bad for Greece. It's not going to have a huge effect on everyone else. Is that the baseline scenario, or is...
I think that's more likely than not right, with two qualifications. One, Greece is on the southeastern flank of Europe, kind of near Russia and kind of near the Middle East. And a destabilized Greece is not without consequence. The containment doctrine and the Truman doctrine embodying the containment strategy was proclaimed with respect to Greece. And that says something about the geostrategic importance of what happens in Greece. Second, I think that's likely to be right. On the other hand, Ben Bernanke, who's very smart and thoughtful, said subprime, it really wasn't very big compared to the whole global capital market, and so it might go wrong, but it really wouldn't have a profound effect on the American economy. That didn't work out so well. Right. Hank Paulson and Ben Bernanke decided that, people had really learned a lesson from Bear Stearns, so it would be okay if Lehman were allowed to fail. And that didn't work out so well. So I think the more likely thing actually is that people have sort of discounted this and already made their adjustments and it won't have a major effect. But there are some experiments that are really best not run. And this is one of them.
Second topic, the Supreme Court sort of got buried amidst the bigger news. The Supreme Court announced they are retaking, in effect, the Fisher versus the University of Texas case, which is essentially the affirmative action case. There seems to be a real chance that the Supreme Court will either substantially restrict or maybe even outlaw affirmative action as we've known it. You thought a lot about issues of diversity, of economic diversity when you were president of Harvard. There is actually a liberal case against affirmative action. People like Rick Kellenberg at the Century Foundation make it, which is that top colleges today are so self-satisfied about diversity. They have attracted a geographically, religiously, ethnically diverse population that economically is extremely homogenous. And the only way to get them to care about economic diversity is to prevent them from using this tool. If they're prevented from using this tool, they will get economic diversity because they will insist on having religious and ethnic diversity. The case on the other side is, by any definition, we are a society that continues to suffer from enormous amounts of racism. It is not cured. What are your thoughts about what the impact would be if the Supreme Court either restricted or banned affirmative action?
If I were on the Supreme Court, I suspect I would vote to uphold affirmative action. I would do that because I just wouldn't want to be on the side of not helping racial minorities. And I would do that because I would think that Harvard University or Stanford University or Timbuktu College probably ought to be able to decide what admissions policies they want to have and not get told which ones they should have and be dictated from Washington. So I'd be on that. I would, at the end of the day, be on that side. I think we underappreciate our achievement with respect to race and we overstate how much progress we've made with respect to equality of opportunity. I don't remember the numbers precisely, but when I was president of Harvard, I had a set of statistics prepared that looked at the chance that you applied to a group of 30 top American colleges, conditional on your having had an SAT of 1400, or we did it an SAT of 1300. So these were being a very good student. If you were black, you were more likely to apply to such a college, conditional on having a high SAT, than if you were white. That is a huge achievement. You were also more likely to get in. But the fact that there was that sense of accessibility, knowledge, and connection is a huge achievement.
Given that for decades, if not centuries, African Americans
given
were
what had
literally
happened
barred.
before. That is a huge achievement. If you had an income that was a family income that was above $200,000, you were about 2.5 times as likely to apply to one of those top colleges as if you had an income below $200,000. And the group that was least likely to apply to such colleges were people with incomes between $50,000 and $100,000 because they thought they couldn't afford to come, and therefore it was out of reach for them. And if you look at the gap in college enrollment rates or college completion rates between kids whose families were in the top quarter of the income distribution and kids whose families were in the bottom quarter of the income distribution, it is much wider today than it was in the 1970s. And so we are failing utterly on this as a challenge. The thing I'm most proud of having done during my time as president of Harvard was I caused the university to commit that any student with an income below $60,000 could come to Harvard paying nothing at all. And that got emulated in a range of other colleges to, I think, substantial benefit. But most colleges can't do what Harvard was able to afford to do. And I think we need a much larger effort around this issue as a country. But I would say one other thing. Higher education gets all the attention because journalists think about higher education and we all relate to our higher education experiences. The single most important problem for equality of opportunity in the United States, which nobody talks about and is not on the public agenda, is the local financing of schools. Systematically, the more disadvantaged you are as a child, the less is spent on your education. In Scarsdale, they can have low tax rates and teach 6 different languages in the high school. In other places where poor kids live, they have to have high tax rates in order to be able to teach 1 language in the high school. And it goes down through the whole system. And so if we were serious as a country about equality of opportunity, we would address the core fact that almost every other industrial country does address, that you need to spend more money educating disadvantaged kids than you do educating advantaged kids. And that discrepancy is, I think, our core weakness. And we can have economic affirmative action or racial affirmative action or both kinds of affirmative action. We can do all that. And I laid out how I think we could do it better. But it's not nearly as important as making the public schools work for the children of kids who are not fortunate. And that and the basic economic underpinning of it is not on our national agenda today.
Your turn. So we have some microphones. You, sir, I would ask you, please keep the questions succinct and keep them questions.
So as someone who's been at the seat of policymaking for a large part of your career, I was very careful to listen to the language that you used to describe income inequality, and it sounded a lot like a campaign. And you talked about the $1 trillion at the top and the $1 trillion at the bottom, but that's not income, that's wealth.
No, that was income.
Well, but when we talk about...
That was annual income.
$1 trillion a year.
Yes.
Okay. Because when we talk about that debate in the country, we talk about who the rich are and who should be taxed, we talk about people who have high income. We don't talk about people who are rich. People who have high income may not be rich. They may just have high income for a year, 5 years, 10 years. But they're the aspiring rich. They're people who are working hard to be rich. You might even say it's correlated with productivity rather than wealth. If we really wanted to tax wealth in this country, we'd have a value-added tax or a sales tax. But you've been in the center of these conversations in government for 30 years, and there seems to be no momentum on either side to think about a fairer, broader-based spending rate-related tax, as opposed to trying to define who earns income and how we classify income and how we can take more of it. I pay 50% of everything that I earn to the federal government, or to the state government, or the city of New York. I don't think I'm undertaxed, but I also think I pay a lot more in income tax or taxes than a lot of people who have substantially bigger bank accounts than I do. And it doesn't seem fair, and it's not going to solve the problem that you described in terms of how we're going to pay for all of these things that we want to pay for.
Look, I don't really hear the music quite the way you do. Very briefly, taxing capital income is taxing wealth, because what wealth produces is capital income. Sales taxes are the most regressive form of tax. And so you won't find anyone anywhere who will tell you that a sales tax is the answer to inequality. My judgment about the best approach to wealth taxation is more serious and substantial estate taxation than we have in the United States.
Which is a wealth tax. Other questions?
Hi, my name's Tane. I just turned 30, so I have my own sense of existential despair. I also feel connected to a lot of people in my generation, I think, because we grew up I came of age during the Great Recession and these things. We're inherently distrustful a lot of times of a lot of these institutions, and as much sense as you can make, there's something just sort of in our gut that we're saying, well, that'll all happen again, and we can't buy into this. And I'm wondering how much just that sense, whether it's logical or not, matters, or whether it's something potentially that we'll just get over, like sideburns or Tom's shoes.
I don't know. I think there's a lot of, I think there probably should be more receptivity, but there's a fair amount of receptivity to thoughts about how to organize things better and how to do things better and how to do things that have less risk. I don't myself particularly think that existential dread is particularly constructive as a posture, and I think it's better to choose better to find a problem and to try to solve it.
I'm actually in some ways impressed by your generation's attitudes. If you look at polling, it's the most optimistic generation about the future of the United States, the questions we were talking about. If you look at voter turnout among people under 30, it's much better than it was for previous generations when they were under 30. And if you look at the things that often go with economic dread, like hatred toward other groups, people under 30 today are the role models for the whole society. Let's keep the microphones going. And it's not that I have anything against men, but let's not have all the questions from men. Yes.
I'm sorry.
In the back.
Yes. Larry, you mentioned that one of your concerns was the rise of China. Why? Don't you think it would be better if in an interdependent world to have a China with a stronger demand that will buy that excess oil that the US will be producing 10 years from now?
I think it's a better world if countries everywhere have better economic performance, and certainly that includes China's economic performance. I think that history is cautionary on rapidly rising economic powers and their integration into the global system. And whether it's Germany before the First World War, or if you were in the Caribbean you saw the United States a certain way at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. So I think that China's economic growth is something that's going to require a lot of management in the global system if it's to work out well. But I certainly did not mean to imply that I thought that the failure of China to grow economically would be better.
Two questions. One is that you brought up about Scarsdale and about less economically privileged areas. New York City spends the most, $16,500 per student, with a 57% dropout rate, and pays their teachers very highly. Why is this situation? You didn't address that. And the same goes with Cambridge, Massachusetts, a huge dropout rate. The second part of my question is that the average student graduating from Harvard goes home to mom and dad and lives there because they can't get an adequate job. Yet if they go to a technical school and become a plumber, electrician, a mason, a carpenter, they make twice the money, half of it in cash, that an average college student makes in America today. What's your comments on those two questions?
Look, on the second, the fact is not close to what you say. About 15% of students live at home. Harvard students live at home after they graduate. That's a pretty high number, but it's nothing like half. The best available evidence is that for the vast majority of students who go to college, they are better off for having gone to college, and people look at it in all kinds of very careful ways by looking at, where there's a cutoff. You look at people just above the cutoff versus just below the cutoff. There have been a variety of ways of studying it. I think the evidence is pretty overwhelming that for the vast majority of people, college is good. I agree with you that we need to find better ways of investing in technical training and vocational training for those for whom college is the wrong choice. I don't pretend to have all the answers or know the answers with respect to the kind of urban school problems that you cite. My daughter teaches in an after-school program in one of the worst neighborhoods in Boston. The cost of just establishing a framework where those kids have a chance to learn, given that their gunfights around their homes each night, given the fraction of their parents who are addicted to cocaine, the cost of providing an environment that works for them is of an entirely different order than the cost of providing an education in their services. Providing an education in the suburb of Boston where I live. So am I for charters? Yes. Am I worried about some of the excess rigidities caused by teachers' unions? Yes. Is there a great deal of dysfunctionality in the way urban schools are managed? Yes. But to think that there aren't also very important resource issues is, I think, a serious mistake.
On the second part, this is one of my favorite questions asked. Does anyone know what the unemployment rate is for people between the ages of 25 and 34 right now who have a bachelor's degree? It's 2%, right? It's 2%. And if people say, well, yeah, but they're all working at Starbucks, the pay gap between people with college degrees and everyone else is at an all-time high. And I think that's really important because what I worry about is that in rooms like this, we talk about how college isn't worth it, and then that shows up in the New York Times, and that shows up in speeches, but all of us are sending our kids to college. We don't doubt that a college degree is worth it, and when we sort of broadcast the message that maybe it's not, we end up affecting the decisions of kids who are actually hurt by it. Because I can write something in the New York Times questioning whether college is worth it. I promise you I'm going to tell my own children to go to college. I actually think it's a really important point that's worth thinking about. Final question right here. Thank you.
Yes, would raising the minimum wage remedy income inequality, or is it bad for business?
Look, when Ronald Reagan was president, I'm not aware of anyone who thought that we had a serious problem of an excessive minimum wage. In the intervening almost 30 years, we've gotten somewhat more productive as an economy. So you would think we should have a higher minimum wage than we had when Ronald Reagan was president. In fact, we have a lower minimum wage than we had when Ronald Reagan was president. So I'm sure, but I am quite confident that raising the minimum wage from the current level would be a good idea, and it would contribute to a reduction in inequality. I think it's important to recognize, though, that a substantial fraction of those who are employed and for whom the minimum wage matters are people doing part-time work, are people who are secondary earners in families, and so I think it would also be a mistake to suppose that increasing the minimum wage by feasible amounts, say to $10, say to $12, would have a large impact in reversing the kinds of trends that I described. But if you ask me, I'm very clearly for an increase in the minimum wage.
Should I give the coin problem, or do you want to?
Go right ahead.
Okay, it's your problem. You have 12 coins. 11 of them are the exact same weight. One of them is a different weight. You have a scale. All the scale will tell you is which side are heavier. You get to use the scale 3 times and only 3 times. And you need to identify what the odd coin is. There's a great philosophical lesson in this. I'm not going to give you the solution now. I'm easy to find on Twitter and other places if you want to try to solve it and you can't. You can tweet at me. You can also Google the answer, as Steve Ratner did yesterday when he and I were on a panel. But I would actually encourage you not to Google the answer, but to try to do it. Larry gave me that problem, and I immensely enjoyed solving it. So thank you all for coming. Thank you, Larry, for doing it.